Good afternoon. In today's discussion, we will be focusing on Congreve's use of wit and his art of characterization in the way of the world. William Congreve clearly possessed the kind of imagination that delighted in a playful ingenuity. Everyone in the comedy The Way of the World seems capable of expressions that a lesser dramatist would have saved for his central or most important characters. Indeed, so abundant is the verbal wit of the way of the world that it would perhaps always trouble those who, with Alexander Pope, wonder if Congreve's fools are fools indeed. But without denying Congreve's exuberant inventiveness, we can still determine his intention in the play. If we cannot always distinguish between a true wit and a witwoud, we can at least understand why Congreve expected a cultivated spectator to do so. The concept of wit requires clear definition. It can be a confusing term, for we are accustomed to equating the Restoration comedy of wit with a philosophical conception of the fancy and judgment. In examining the implications of these terms, Hobbes and Locke established the preeminence of judgment over fancy. However, the dramatist's effort to translate these notions into comedy necessitated a reversal of this priority. Congreve's exuberance is a consequence of this dramatic necessity, but it does not value language solely for its power to charm or attract. His dramatic aims are basically in keeping with Dryden's definition of wit. In Dryden's usage, or according to Dryden, wit refers to more than verbal wordplay such as puns, similitudes, antithesis, etc. It also points to a traditional ideal of decorum, by which he meant a propriety of words and thoughts, whose rhetorical basis provides a standard by which false wit can be judged and separated from true wit. Dryden's attitude is reinforced by the opinion expressed elsewhere that verbal wit serves primarily as an entertainment for the vulgar judges, who he believes are 9 parts in 10 of all nations. Unquote. It is perhaps difficult to assess the importance of this view for the way of the world, since Congreve never precisely defines wit, but on the basis of his criticism of the hasty judges quote unquote, who condemned the play, we can surmise that true wit may mean more than verbal virtuosity. In the dedication, Congreve stresses that affected wit is superior to natural folly as a subject for the comic dramatist. The distinction is between a conception of comedy in which the action is largely farce and one in which the affected wit offers a verbal equivalent to farce without being merely symptomatic of particular humors or types. If this explanation is valid, his false wits need not be natural fools but only ordinary mortals, whose pretensions have led them into the magazine of improprieties, noted by George Meredith. In other words, the basic conception of Congreve's idea of wit is significantly indicated by what Dryden considered wit to be. It is a commonplace of criticism of the way of the world that its complications make it difficult to perform on stage. However, the intricate pattern of deceptions and confusion of social and familial relationships in the comedy are essential. These complexities in plot become scenic, providing a deliberately clouded atmosphere which the spectator sees as the manifestation of a social world which is contrived, planned, significantly artificial, and committed to developing the appearance rather than the substance of value. The action of the comedy is the emergence of a relationship between Mirabelle and Millamant, which not only cuts through the typical comic obstacle provided by the older generation, but which also penetrates the complex artifices of the society and moves toward the deliberate sharing of genuine real feeling. Disguise is a complex metaphor in Congreve's way of the world, in which the real world of human experience is in tension and continuous conflict with characters and worlds created by personal and social rituals, which are in a sense disguises. The comedy concerns characters who construct elaborate images of themselves because they are unable to function successfully within their true identity or are unable to apprehend their true identity. In fact, the primary expenditure of energy in the way of the world is the imposition of some form of mask upon the real self. In the world of the play, the ideal is a paradigm of youth, beauty, wealth, and wit. Each of these qualities, of course, is a means of power over others. The power of youth in energy, mind, and sex, the power implicit in being the object of sexual desire, the power of money, and the power of wit in perception and social manipulation. Most of the characters in the play lack this combination of virtues, and their energy is directed towards imitating those virtues which they do not have or cannot ever obtain. For example, Witwoud and Petulant pose as clever men whose perceptions can be expressed in verbal expertise in order to meet the demands of a world which values wit, unaware that they themselves are consistently the victims in rhetorical battles. Lady Wishfort, for example, subjects herself to humiliation in the affair with Waitwell that falls Sir Rowland, not merely because of her own appetite, but also because she wants to project the appearance of youth and desirability, supplementing her financial power with the attraction of sexual beauty once again. Social relationships in this contrived world are acting out of personal images of the self, and those images are indeed fragile. To those characters with a degree of wit, the images of the others are transparent, but in the usual practices of the society, one acts as if the disguise of the other were the truth. Consequently, while the image may be transparent, its transparency may not be known by the bearer. The characters fear that the reality of their own experience, such as their age, their ignorance, their tendency to adultery, deceitfulness, will be exposed. A major source of power in the play is the threat of exposure. Fainall, for example, is able to exert his strength over Lady Wishfort and Mrs. Fainall because they fear the revelation of Arabella Fainall's folly and past relationship with Mirabelle. Mirabelle attempts to use the exposure of Lady Wishfort's folly with Waitwell, and he himself have been vulnerable to Mrs. Marwood's revelation of his earlier deceit of Lady Wishfort. In addition to these cruel, deliberate exposures, Congreve subtly reveals the presence of real feeling which shows through the mask of affectation. For example, Mirabelle's agitated displeasure is displayed in the carelessness with which he plays cards with Fainall during the play's opening moments. When he discusses his relationship with Mrs. Marwood, whom he suspects is Fainall's mistress, his studied attitude is interpreted by Fainall as an attempt to obscure his true feelings. Fainall accuses him, and I quote, "You speak with an indifference which seems to be affected, and confesses you are conscious of a negligence." However, Fainall's own aggressive pursuing of the point discloses the emotional content of his controlled language, and Mirabel thrusts, and I quote, "You pursue the argument with a distrust that seems to be unaffected, and confesses you are conscious of a concern for which the lady is more indebted to you than your wife." The insistent exploration of value conducted by the characters of the way of the world derives from their profound uncertainty, as it were, of their own personal identity or implicit worth or value. The women remind themselves ceaselessly that as an object of love, one's value suffers a precarious existence, subject to the whims and arbitrary appetites of the lover. Mrs. Fainall declares to Mrs. Marwood, and I quote, it's a fairly long declaration and a forceful at that. "If we be happy, we must find the means in ourselves and among ourselves. Men are ever in extremes," she says, "either doting or averse. While they are lovers, if they have fire and sense, their jealousies are unsupportable. And when they cease to love, we ought to think at least, they loathe. They look upon us with horror and distaste. They must meet us like the ghosts of what we were, and as from such, fly from us." This occurs in Act 2, Scene 1. This speech examines the paradox of the sexual relationship, that once the appetite has been satisfied, the object of appetite is devalued in the imagination of the lover. Responding to this sense of love, Mrs. Marwood professes a realistic attitude towards time and love, and she quotes, "True, it is an unhappy circumstance of life that love should ever die before us, and that the man so often should outlive the lover. But say what you will, it is better to be left than never to have loved. To pass our youth in dull indifference, to refuse the sweets of life because they must once leave us, is as preposterous as to wish to have been born old because we one day must be old. For my part, my youth must wear and waste, but it shall never rust in my possession." This he says in Act 2, Scene 1. Of course, almost immediately after this exchange, Mrs. Fainall and Mrs. Marwood confess that they despise men and have been feigning this realistic attitude towards love in order to test each other. However, the irony of these confessions is complete once we know that both of them are the victims of a love for Mirabel, and that they see themselves as the devalued objects of Mirabel's imagination, the distasted relics of an appetite now satisfied elsewhere. The typical comic action is an action of clarification, unraveling, revealing the identity of that which was obscured and disguised. Frequently, the comic plot depends upon a malicious deceit, and the comic resolution unmasks the deceiver. As often in Shakespeare's romantic comedies, for example, the resolution builds up on the comic action is the assumption of the mask and its removal. The obscuring and clarifying of identity, which includes most comedies of the time, also includes a sense of conscious deceit of the villain. The mask is frequently more than an explicit disguise. Often, it is the exercise or manifestation of some psychic obscuring. To summarize, self-awareness, knowledge of society, generosity, and amused irony. These qualities define true wit in Congreve's The Way of the World, and provide the play with a moral norm, a moral standard to judge others, and a viable lifestyle. It is important to see that there is no alternative, if I may put the word alternative within quotes, to the way of the world in the sense of an escape from it. The play's curiously uncomic dramatic atmosphere is world-weary, tired, tristful, even bitter. Fenall, trying desperately to reconcile Marwood to their wretched fate, cries out, and I quote, "I'll hate my wife yet more, damn her. I'll part with her, rob her of all she's worth, and will retire somewhere, anywhere to another world." Unquote. Such a retreat, such an alternative is usually impossible, and when in the last act Lady Wishford pleads with Marwood and says, "Let us leave the world and retire by ourselves and be shepherdesses," unquote, the laughter is joyless. This note of sadness is heard even in the hero and the heroine. The triumph of the wits is a private triumph, and the central concern in Congreve's last three plays is the absolute necessity of maintaining a guarded public self while maintaining the value of a private relationship. An adequate reading of Congreve must rest finally on the realization that the style, the verbal pattern of this comedy is thematically significant and the key to the playwright's comic vision. This vision, revealed most fully in the last three comedies of Congreve, is of continuing and serious conflict of true wit, civilized and self-aware, with those who would block his goals or threaten his integrity. Linguistic acuity of the witty couple reflects their achievement. Their discipline, poise, and integrity will a discipline, poise, and integrity, all the more remarkable when set against the way of the world. Congreve was able to develop a genuinely sensitive and individual mode of expression, one that differentiates and evaluates the various characters through the language they use. Though the clash of these complex characters, and through them, one might even say the clash of the language, Congreve develops the moral realism that makes him the most complex and significant comic playwright of the Restoration age. Thank you.